Welcome to Friendly Disruption. This is episode 12. This month, we don't do these weekly. Yeah, I don't know if we could do them weekly. This month, we have with us Noreen Bush, who's the Associate Superintendent at Cedar Rapids Community Schools. We're thrilled to have her with us. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about OCR, what it is, what the tools are to do that, and why it's important. And then we'll blend into a conversation about personalized learning and UDL. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maggie to talk a little bit about OCR, what it is, what you might use it, why it's important, why you should care.
All right. So OCR, I'm sure it's a term that folks have heard for some time now. I think when I think about OCR, sometimes my brain flips back to about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, with a tool that some listeners might be familiar with, Kurzweil. And so optical character recognition is what OCR stands for. And essentially what it does is it takes images and it searches for text. So say you might have an image of a menu, and when you put that through optical character recognition or OCR, it will take the text on that menu and recognize it and put it into words and phrases. And then essentially what you can do is lay some text-to-speech software over that and have it read aloud. That's how we utilize it. So I talked about Kurzweil when I first started talking about OCR. Kurzweil was a few years back scanning software of the big clunky scanners, and you have to lay a textbook or cut a textbook up and lay it on the scanner and scan page by page, and then it would send it to a computer, and then you'd have to compile it and flip it. It was a process. We are in the 21st century, and we are about a decade or two past that, where I can take my phone, or we can take built-in software on a computer and have optical character recognition run on text like that. And so one tool, I think Craig is going to talk about some built-in features of Google.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I was really thinking about it, and Maggie did a great job of covering the basics, but at Prairie, we're thinking about accessible education materials, AEM, in terms of kind of three things. There's three big chunks to it. The first being that we got to get a hold of a handle on how we purchase things and bring them into the district, so that everything we bring in going forward can be utilized in multiple formats, so that all of our learners have equal access to it. The other thing we need to do, and we've talked a lot about this, we've talked about tools like, I know that AIMS, they use Snap to Read, or Snap and Read. We use Read and Write for Google by TextHelp, but they're really about the same thing, sort of a text reader, speech to text tool. And it certainly isn't the end all be all for accessibility, but tools like that make a big dent, and you can get a lot of mileage out of those. The third piece of the triad, though, or the third leg of the stool, is what do you do with all that existing material that teachers might have that's instructional, that's in analog formats, like paper, right? And so for the last almost year, I've been looking for good OCR stuff. And a while back, one of our episodes on this podcast, we talked about an app called Prismo, which is a really good one. And we like that, and we bought that several licenses for all of our buildings, and that was quite good. But I was kind of shocked to learn that, and maybe everybody else knew this, but it was really news to me that the Google G Suite has a really rockin' OCR engine built into it. I was at a couple weeks ago, I was at ATIA, which is the National Ed Tech Show, or Assistive Tech Show. Sorry about that. And it was an incredible experience. It was in Orlando, Florida, and learned tons and tons there. But there was this one session. I sat in on a session presented by Google, where they had all their sort of G Suite developers there, and all of the people in the room had some sort of otherness to them. I don't even want to call it disability, but the lead guy who was doing the G Suite stuff, because they were covering all of the Google tools, it wasn't just G Suite. But the guy who was talking mostly about G Suite was blind. He was completely blind, and he was talking about all the great accessibility tools built into sites and forms and everything else. And then someone asked him a question. This was at the very end of the session. It was almost the time when everybody was getting up to leave, and asked him about OCR and if they had any solutions or ideas for that. And he just sort of offhandedly said, "Oh yeah, we've had OCR built in for years. Here's all you do." And he just kind of walked through it. and I'll show it to you, or I'll talk you through it in a second. And as he did this, I'm sitting next to Cheryl Kibbers, who's our student services director, and we're just like going, what? And then I start getting, my phone starts going off, and I look behind me, and Gina is behind me from the AEA. Right. And yeah, and she is going crazy. She's texting me going, are you seeing this? Are you seeing? I'm trying, it's working. And so, you know, we have this sort of moment in the session where we're all like, this is awesome. So really, it's shockingly simple. So as Maggie pointed out, all you need to do is use your phone. You can take a picture of the document, and I did it right there on the spot with a document that had a great deal of graphic content on it. So a lot of graphics, had different shading of text, had the text broken up into different boxes. And I intentionally took the photo so there were shadows thrown across it. And then I even went the extra step of orienting the photo the wrong way, so that it was oriented sideways instead of, you know, as a way you normally read a document. And you take that picture, which is just a straight JPEG off your phone. I dropped it into Drive. I saved it to my Google Drive account. I then right-clicked on it, and there's a submenu that pops up when you right-click on a document. And I just said, Open with Docs. That was it. That's how simple it is. And when you do that, it creates a brand new Google Doc. It drops the image of the picture you took at the top of the document. And by the way, even if it's upside down or backwards, it orients that image the right way. And then it takes and it dropped all that text in right below it. And it even shockingly did some of the formatting, because some of the text was different size, different typeface, bolded. Now, it didn't get it 100% right, but it got it really close, and none of the characters were wrong. That was the big thing, is the text was actually technically perfect. So I took this, it was actually a slide of UDL. So it was kind of 3 boxes with engagement, representation, and God, what's the third one? I can't think of the third UDL. Access. And it had all that stuff. It had a picture of a brain, and it was all shaded different colors. And it took all that stuff beautifully and moved it right into a Google Doc that was easily comprehensible. And the beauty of it was, it would have been so easy then for me just to say, okay, read and write, go read that for me. Or let me, you know, interact with that text to do a quick write on it. It was beautiful.
So Craig, how are you taking that and putting it into practice with your folks there in college community?
Well, you know, the first thing I did was I kind of shouted it from the hilltops when I got back. You know, I put it out on my professional blog. I made sure it got in front of our AEM committee, and I showed it to our teacher librarians. About a month before this, I went ahead and, as part of our AEM plan, I went around and met with a team at each building to actually divvy out a license of Prismo. But at that time, I was pretty clear, at least I tried to be, that when we talked with them, I said, listen, what I'm giving you here, ultimately what we're looking for is a toolbox, you know, a toolkit for you to work with. And honestly, I'm just giving you a screwdriver at this point. And I'm not sure it's the best screwdriver. So when I got back from Florida, I met with all those teams again. I emailed them all directly. I said, listen, remember when I told you I was giving you a screwdriver and I wasn't sure it was the best screwdriver? Well, guess what? I'm giving you a new screwdriver. You can still keep the old one, but this one I think is even better. So we got it out into those team members who were focusing on that. And those folks had committed already to bring these tools up in front of their cadre, into PLC meetings, you know, really try to operationalize it. And we've already seen some headway with that in some really interesting ways about, you know, in some of our elementaries with, you know, kids getting access, particularly our intermediate kids in 3rd and 4th grade getting, you know, using screen readers in ways that they just hadn't before.
Yeah. And that nice thing about that is that Google has integrated that in so many things. So you look at Google Keep, which is a very underrated tool. You know, I have my other people that say the same thing, but Google Keep actually has that built in where, so our kids in the middle school, they have the brand new Chromebooks with the world facing camera. They could actually take a picture of anything in front of them and put them to a keep note. And they have that option right there, always available to just drag that text out right away. Especially our kids who are our ELLs who need to translate it. That's gonna be a much easier way to translate with Google Translate is by having that text available.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I did actually know that there was an OCR tool built into Keep, but it never occurred to me. This is how, how busy our lives get. It never occurred to me to generalize that out and to look at it in terms of docs. I mean, it was just right there in front of me and I never realized it.
It's just that feature that you have to switch on. And I think that's where sometimes we forget about those built-in features.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know there's analogs in the Microsoft world too, Maggie, right?
Yes, there are. I kind of have that song, anything you can do, I can do better, playing in my head. So I do want to give out a shout out. I love Google. I'm kind of agnostic. I can kind of play in any ballpark. But Microsoft in this realm recently has just like, they are on fire. So one of the tools that they've really utilized and what we've been teaching our students to use is an app called Office Lens. It's a scanning app. And so when you go into Office Lens, it's simply, like you said, you take a picture, right? But with this particular app, instead of taking a picture, you can take a picture and import it, but instead of taking just an actual picture, you scan it. And so on the phone come up like those lines that capture a document, and it kind of like tries to narrow it in. And so it snaps a picture, and then right there automatically it turns into a scan of the document. From there, I can choose to save that scanned document into a PDF, a JPEG, a Word document. And so that's what we've been doing. And so then from there, it just saves in my Office 365, my OneDrive, and I can put it into any folder that I want in any format that I want. And what it does is it drops it really nicely into a Word doc. If I want to write some stuff into it, it puts it into a PDF. If I want to keep the original formation of the text, and voila, it's run OCR, and then we can lay over whatever software we choose. And so if we want to use a built-in Microsoft tool, we can do that through Microsoft Edge. The new Edge browser has a read aloud option. So it's just a right click, and you highlight text and a right click and it reads it aloud. Otherwise, we also use read and write software in our district, and that's either through the Edge browser add-on or through our software bar that's actually loaded onto the computer itself. It's pretty slick. And what I like about it is that it does a really nice job, but if it doesn't capture a certain component to it, it doesn't put in a jumbled mess. It just takes the piece that it couldn't read and it sticks it there as a part, like a partial image.
Oh, sure.
And so instead of, sometimes you get like these characters and these odd things that look like just a jumbled mess, it instead just inserts that piece. So you can kind of get a feel if it does miss, but it doesn't miss often.
Yeah, what I think happens there is I think it takes its best guess at what the Unicode character is. And there's tens of thousands of those, and they're weird stuff, so. And
you just started talking a little bit of a different language to me.
Sorry about that.
But somebody talked about translation. What's cool about that is then we can take our translation, and there are, Microsoft has a bajillion different languages that it can automatically translate. If you dump that OCR into a Word document, you can highlight, translate, and you're off to the races. We've actually used this. We've actually communicated this to a couple of our secretaries who interact with English learners and their families often. And it's just kind of given a little bridge to that communication. Yeah.
What amazes me, well, I was just going to say what amazes me about, just this conversation of discovery, really. And so it doesn't take much, what I have found, to help people understand accessibility. But if it's not a direct instructional moment, they won't know. So my son taught me something about my own phone this week that I didn't even realize, because I haven't taken the time to dig into that particular component of my phone. And so it's just this pause moment. And Craig knows this story, but I tell it over and over again because it was such an aha for me, not just as an administrator as a district, but as a teacher as well. And when we introduced Read Write Google, I was formerly at College Community with Craig, and now I'm with Maggie in Cedar Rapids, also using a Read Write environment. But we had a teacher who was gone for a period of time for a maternity leave, and we just needed to support a couple classrooms as we were down a sub, and I'm a former English teacher. There were some students who hadn't completed a personal essay due to just the inconsistency of a teacher not being able to be there. And I was introducing the classroom to the read-write software, and I was just speaking, and it was, capturing my text. And this was really, I'm telling you, it was like a 60-second demonstration. And a kid in the back of the room, I won't say every word he said. But
it's too bad you can't, because it's so much better with the real language.
It's so much better with the real language. But he was like, no kidding, except he didn't say kidding. And I said, I'm not kidding. This is what it does. And this is a student who English, the course was not his favorite gig, right? That night at midnight, I had a shared doc from him that probably had the best voice. If you talk about writing voice, from just about any of those personal essays that I gathered from that particular class. And it took 60 seconds for him to know that was a possibility for him. So if you think about this OCR capability, whether it be the app that Maggie just introduced, or whether it's within the Google environment, from an instructional point of view, literally in 1 second, the difference you can make for a student to give them access to materials that they had no idea they would have access to, whether it be ELL or a student with dysgraphia or dysnomia. What an opportunity. And our secretaries, I mean, this is the front line to introduce families to our district. So those 60-second moments are just, I love those moments where people can actually understand how to use a tool.
So go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to say, the big thing, I mean, they're constantly updating, constantly changing. So I do get it's hard for a lot of teachers to stay up to date on what's coming out, especially, like Google Keep is something that hasn't been around that long. But even tonight, like, I said earlier, I came straight from one of our Google boot camps. As a Google trainer, I have to keep aware of everything that's coming out. And then, we had teachers and they're like, how long has this been out? I'm like, a year or two. I mean, it's been out for a while, and the OCR function is just, it's hidden in there. So to constantly just be reminding people what's available, what we can do, I think that's going to be the thing. Cause you talk about those moments they can actually use it. It got to be prepared for that. Cause, even we had a teacher who was working with some English language learners, and their textbook, they couldn't understand it at all. So just popping the Google Translate app on their phone, they're able to translate the text for them just in the image. And that was a feature that even the teacher didn't know about. So, I mean, that's just kind of those things. You just gotta, I try to keep teachers informed as much as possible. Again, like you said, if it's not something they're going to be able to use that moment, they're probably not going to pay attention, because there's so many updates coming out all the time.
Speaking of that, I want to make sure we're clear for our listeners on a couple of things. First off, we're going to be putting out on our Twitter account a new blog that Patrick has set up for us that we're going to be using, and we'll probably do some sort of post-show write-up about a little more detail about some of these tools. So if you're interested in some of the things Maggie talked about, that I talked about, or that Patrick's talked about, we're going to try to, within a week or so after the show, get a little more detail written up on that blog, and we'll post it on the Twitter feed. So if you follow us at the Twitter handle of FDisruption on Twitter, you can find that as the entry point. The other thing I always feel like I need to say is I love Noreen's story. That is one of my favorite educational stories for a bunch of reasons. But the first one is that I just love the notion that Noreen is sitting in our central office wearing 60 million hats and goes, I've really got nothing better to do. We're down a sub. Let me go back and correct some English papers.
It was completely selfish, and really that classroom wasn't that far away from my office.
Yeah, but I just it makes me smile every time. And then the student's language, which was much more colorful than what she did.
Can I tell you? That story made it all the way back to my boss, and she came to me and she goes, "Maggie, guess what these students are doing?" And so the story's made it around.
The kid really is infamous, but but what's so awesome is like he wasn't turning in papers ever, and all I had to say to him, not just showing him the tool, but like, you have the best voice. Like, I'm telling you, that kid can tell stories, and with language.
So let's talk about that for a second. So, because that's really the meat of the next phase of what I want to, what I'd like to spend our time talking about, which is how access and universal design, UDL, and personalized learning all snap together in a way that powerfully impacts kids. So think about the differences that made for that child, right? I mean, you unlocked a strength that he wasn't even aware that he had, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, what we have to do, and this is a recurring theme on our show, is we have to win the hearts and minds of not only our kids, but more importantly, our teachers, to get them to think about what is writing, what is reading. I'll relate another quick story here, but while I was at ATI, at the end of January, there was a session put on by the people from the State Department in Indiana, and they did this really incredible session. And as I told the rest of the team before we came on air tonight, I'm really jealous. I feel like I was significantly behind in this arena, unfortunately. And I'm not blaming anybody at the DE. I think the DE is doing the very best they can with the resources available. It's just that their funding level and their personnel staffing levels are just so low. I don't think they have the capacity to do some of this work. But anyway, in the session, we were going over the Indiana model, and we got to the really hard question of what is reading. And I'm not talking about it from a special ed standpoint where it's a little easier to answer, maybe where you can write it into the IEP, what that looks like. But what does reading look like for all kids? And is there such a thing as auditory reading? And I think the answer is yes. And is there such a thing as, tactile reading with Braille? Yes.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a question of, well, how do these relate together if you're talking about decoding, listening, touching, okay? And these are interesting, really deep questions. And I kind of pushed on the presenters a little bit on this. And there was this, I'm sure they didn't like me for it, because it turned into this thing where this lady behind me was like, hallelujah. I mean, it was like being in church or something. She's like, you're exactly right. We need to have this conversation on a global level, and then some lady in the back of the room stood up and said, now listen, we've got it. We can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Kids have to learn how to decode. We shouldn't just, we're doing a disservice if we don't teach them how to decode. And then the lady behind me goes, you're saying things that people who are getting in my way at my district say all the time. And then it was on. It was like this classic throwdown in this session where the presenters totally lost the room. And these two women I thought were going to end up in some sort of wrestling match. But these are the kind of debates we need to be having, because I'm not sure I've got that all figured out either. It's a great conversation. And so I want us to not necessarily talk about that, but I want you to think, I want to talk a little bit about, voice choice, strength-based education, and how UDL snaps into that. That's really the conversation I'm interested in having. And so, Noreen, I'll just turn it over to you with some, hit on any of those things that resonate with you.
Well, of course, they all resonate with me. But, when I think about 15 years ago when we were really trying to define literacy, and it wasn't specifically reading, it was about digital literacy and math literacy and science literacy and social studies literacy. And we were marrying literacy to all the other core areas, as well as then even digital literacies, I know are now called the new literacies. And so, in that we really came down to literacy is learning. And I remember adopting that as kind of a universal definition. So whenever I think about reading, and I think about the best reading teacher I've ever known and really helped mentor me when I was an elementary principal, I went from high school to middle school to elementary. And every single time I took a leap, in the other direction, I always would say, oh, this is the place where I was supposed to be, excited at every single part of that journey. But when I was a preschool through fourth grade principal, had about 600 kids in my building. And I was also a middle school principal at that same year. My facilitator in that building taught me so much about reading and what it meant to have accessibility, and that reading was really about the initial stages of learning. And it wasn't just about text and decoding text. It was also about visuals and understanding how to unpack the learning of posters and of videos and what comprehension actually means. So even though decoding is important when we look at text, ultimately it's not decoding. We want kids to understand and make meaning. And so whenever I think about reading, I always say it's the learning, it's the stages of learning, and we want kids to make meaning. So when I think about personalized learning, that's what we want kids to be able to make meaning of everything around them through. When I think about the co-creation parts of personalized learning, to me, that's one of the most profound pillars of personalized learning, and that a student is the one really guiding the questions and guiding the challenges that they're navigating through a learning journey, and that they have the opportunity to own what that looks like. And so when I even think about my own children when they were toddlers, it was a very co-creation journey as a parent. I mean, I wasn't always telling them what to learn. They were learning it, and then I was supporting it as they were toddlers. And as soon as they started hitting the opportunity to really understand text, all of a sudden I was shoving it in front of them of how I thought a student should learn how to read as a parent. And if I could, I always say to my oldest son, he's 17, and when he hit high school, I said, I want you to know, now I can really help you. I want to apologize for the first 14 years of your life because I didn't know all the research when you were an infant and a toddler, but I know this zone very well, and now I can really help you. And he's a kid who really, through osmosis, got language. I mean, it was just a genetic coding with him. He just understood things. Whereas my second child, that was not his experience. So when I think about personalized learning and what it really means to be literate, it's that kids can make meaning of whatever content's in front of them or the experience that they have. But if they can co-create that experience and have an opportunity to develop what that looks like, that's the personalized path.
Well, and I appreciate that because one of the things that really resonates with UDL, and the more I learn about it, the more I kind of the more coherent it is to me, the more it makes sense. And one of the things I think you're talking about in the language they would use in that research framework would be developing expert teachers and expert learners. So
and expert systems.
Right. Right.
Oh, she's used my favorite word. Thank you, Maggie.
I didn't use it. The book, all the research uses it.
Yeah. Favorite word, systems. Systems.
So yeah, I mean, so it's the idea that and those of you who listen to this probably know what I'm going to say next, but there needs to be, just particularly in our secondary schools, different relationships between our teachers and their content, and I think right now we let content drive so much of what we do, and content's important. I don't want to make it seem like it's not, but really, the becoming an expert teacher, where you could teach anything, that you understand the art of teaching, is probably, in my mind, a much more high leverage skill set than really knowing your content well.
Well, and I think go ahead, Noreen.
No, that's all right. Go ahead, Maggie.
Well, I was just thinking, in addition to, the content around reading, writing, science, math, I think there are a lot of misconceptions that I am the know-all be-all as a teacher, and I will give you the learning. The research is very clear about students taking charge of their learning, but in order to take charge of their learning, they not only have to have some understanding of the environment or the tasks that they're being asked to do, but they have to know about themselves enough to say, what are my strengths? What are my challenges? And what am I personally working on as I work through these tasks that I'm being presented with? And I think, I've been putting some learning together for a group of folks, and I keep digging back into the research, and it's very clear to me that until we can help students learn about their strengths and their weaknesses and articulate that, it's kind of hard to get to that next level of addressing the content in a way that's personalized.
That's a good mentor of mine, and Craig's too, quite frankly. He would always speak about opportunity systems, but strengths-based models. And unfortunately, our school system has been structured to take the body of students and then put them in a system that is one target, one central idea. And what happens when it's this same age, is in the same grade, covering the same types of instruction, and we hope that the core instruction meets all, and then when they don't, then they're going to be interventioned or whatever. And so, these have been the systems that we've lived in. But if you think about that, it's a real deficit model. And so you're putting every student into this funnel. And when it doesn't work, you do more and work harder, do more and work harder. The kids doing more, they're working harder, teachers doing more, teachers working harder, and it becomes this deficit model. And if you were to flip that, and if you think about it as like almost an hourglass, and you've got the body of students funneling up into the system, but if you were to flip that hourglass and you think about it from the smallest point, that is each individual child, and you have more of a divergent thinking process of their strengths, their interests, and what they do really well, and you open it up, it becomes much more of a possibilities, opportunity system instead of a deficit, shove everybody into the same process system. Allison Zamuda, one thing that she does in her book of Students at the Center, I really appreciate very early on in the book, is she defines the evolving roles of students and teachers in 3 instructional models. And sometimes what happens within our profession is we start using words synonymously only because we don't know the difference. But she distinctly differentiates between differentiation, individualization, and personalized learning. And I think it's really important that folks understand that differentiation of those 3 models, because there's a time and place for direct instruction. There's a time and place for an expert teacher who is guiding the learning task, and they can individualize that learning task for learners' needs. And so I don't think it is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're saying teachers are never to be the content experts. They definitely can be, especially when that's what the driving learning need is. And then differentiation is also maybe teacher directed, in that we know what every student might be learning, a common theme in language arts, but the differentiation is they're each reading different texts towards that common theme. And then finally, then you have personalized learning, where the student really is that co-creator. They might know what the learning target is, but the teacher's so comfortable and so skilled and masterful in facilitating the learning that they're really comfortable in helping students guide that journey. And so it's okay to be on that continuum, but people need to know that there's a difference between those terms.
And yeah, I definitely agree with you, because I think you get a lot of teachers that confuse differentiation with, I have to come up with 30 different lesson plans for 30 different students, but that's not the case. It's, there's a lot. I mean, that's not what you're ever going to do. You don't have time to do that. But what can you do for those different types of learners, the different, needs in the classroom? One of the last things I learned, my second to last year in the classroom, I started figuring out I didn't need to cover all that content. Once I started focusing on actual learning instead of covering content, I started doing a lot better. And I gave my students more choices. I gave them more options on how to learn and how to show their learning. And that was my favorite year of teaching ever. But it's that thing. I think we have so many people that, they feel the content's so important. We don't have enough time to cover all the content. And once they start getting around that idea that we can teach less and learn more, that's why I think we start seeing a lot of growth.
One of the videos I just saw, there was another big takeaway from ATIA. I'm going to keep coming back to that because it was a great experience. But I'm sure many of you have already seen this. Probably everybody else has seen this except me, because I'm kind of a newbie at all this stuff. But there was a TED Talk done a couple of years ago. I think the guy's last name was Rose, and he did a TED Talk on the name of it was The Myth of Average.
Yeah, the jagged profiles.
Yeah, and the idea that if you're teaching to the average and you're not designing to the edge, if you teach to the average kid, you're teaching to no one. And that language resonates with me so powerfully in this idea of, as you said, a jagged profile, Noreen, and the idea that the example he gives is how the Air Force in the 1950s was tasked with designing, different cockpit systems for fighter planes. And they ended up coming with things we just take for granted now, like adjustable seats. But those things didn't exist before that. And, as teachers, that's what this accessibility thing, that's what makes perfect sense to me.
And I sometimes I love what you said, Patrick, about sometimes that it can feel overwhelming for teachers, because let's face it, right? If you're a secondary teacher, if you're a high school teacher, you could have between 100 and 180 kids a day. And to think about what it means to know every single one of those 180 learners to the level to personalize everything that they need, that's overwhelming. But the concept of kids co-creating, especially in a high school environment where they can be very independent learners, you have to create the structures and systems and feel confident in your own the understanding of the standards in which you're trying to facilitate in order to certify those standards in different ways. And so when I think about learning environments, for example, like the Iowa Big School, my own son is participating in Iowa Big. It has been a learning journey, I tell you. This is a kid who finds it, who is very comfortable with people prescribing his learning to him. Okay, like he can show up, he's gonna do exactly what he needs to do, and the thing that he'll have the biggest takeaway that I could have never provided for him in a school experience, unless he had this experience, is he's the driver. And that has been uncomfortable for him. And that is the number one thing that he will take away into his future that gives me great joy as a parent. I could care less about his grade, but him driving learning in a passionate way, he's writing things for the Iowa History Center, to certify his history standards. But his teacher is very confident and comfortable in knowing how to certify those standards, because he knows the standards so deeply, he can recognize when a student has mastered them.
So, Noreen, I think you touch on something that's very interesting, and it's the way that students then approach their learning. You just described your son prior to Iowa Big as being more of a passive. I mean, he was very engaged and he'd get the work done, but just passively, okay, yeah, kind of bobblehead, right? I'll do what you want me to do, sure. But
I may not like it behind your back, and I'm going to crab about it, but I'm going to get it done.
Because that's his personality. But then we also have other students who, instead of going with the flow, if things are difficult for them, they might start to feel anxious and maybe try to escape the situation, or create a diversion so that they don't have to do what's being asked of them to do, instead of taking their learning and being the driver in the driver's seat. And so I think handing the reins over, so to say, it's more than just about the relationship between the teacher and the students. It's about the relationship between the student and their ability to just come to the table in different fashions.
So what could we do that is even, I can't even imagine a greater thing that we could do for kids. Our vision at Cedar Rapids is every learner future ready. And we're developing a profile of a graduate that defines competencies that we want them to exit our system. That's far beyond. Content mastery is only one component of those competencies. We want so much more for them, which means that they have to know themselves as learners. And so when we have a system that is very prescriptive and one-notish, then the students who are not feeling engaged in that process, maybe ever, and then we question ourselves, or we might start saying things like, well, they're not motivated, or they're really, they're not trying, or they really, they're if they would just show up and try, then, maybe they would do better. And we start using a blame language that I've observed this in my 25 plus years, that the blame starts becoming on the student, especially as they get older. instead of thinking about focusing on the structures and the systems that started disengaging our kids. So when I think about access for all, I appreciate, you know, our efforts in Cedar Rapids to give access to our students who have greater needs. And so whether that be that they qualify for 504, or they qualify for special education and giving them access, but I find inequities everywhere. Whether it be through socioeconomic situations, or kids who've been transient, or kids perhaps have an unidentified learning need, or maybe they haven't found themselves yet. And if we can provide opportunity for them through teachers, like the simple app that you described, Maggie, I didn't even know about. I've already written it down. Okay. I'm in the system. I didn't even know about it. So, but if a teacher knows about that app, can easily use it, boom, get it on a tool within their classroom, in stations, or whatever the case may be. It does not have to be huge, profound, unbelievable lesson plans that are miles, millions of miles long. It's just a simple procedures to give kids access to what they need. I come back to that story, Absolutely. Craig, about the student, who's like, no kidding, I can talk to this thing and it's going to write my paper for me. Yeah, it's your words, it's your voice, it's your story. But you don't like to write because probably he has some sort of dysgraphia or dysnomia or who knows what. But it was still his thoughts. They were still his writing. It was still his production of a great story. And so the fact that something else typed it for him, great skills for him to have.
It's all about the feedback loop at that point. I think it's not all about it, but I think that's a big part of it because, with kids like that, and frankly, I was one of those kids. I don't know if I'm a good writer. Well, no, I shouldn't say it. I think I'm pretty good at writing now. And I take some pride in it. And, but, coming up in my K-12 experience, I wouldn't have described myself that way. And I think it comes largely through kind of a feedback cycle that you get. And so when you get an opportunity to demonstrate a strength or be successful, then instead of having that sort of negative feedback loop where, okay, so he didn't want to write the paper, so the paper was late, so then he didn't put enough effort into it, and the product is bad, and you can see where the cycle goes from there, to the point where the tool makes that sort of impediment invisible, whether it's a disability or just simply an impediment. It doesn't even matter at that point, in my mind.
But I think sorry, Craig, sorry.
It's all right. I'm just saying, I don't think it matters, and on a really significant level, because ultimately what we're interested in is what the kid can output. And if the kid can output the right stuff, the good stuff, they're going to get the feedback loop that's going to actually develop them into probably someone who can actually keyboard and type or write in ways that are much more expressive. And it opens doors rather than closing them. As Noreen said earlier, and I feel like I have to pay tribute to our dear friend Al Rowe.
I love Al.
Who she was referencing. I do too. I mean, he was shaped so much of my career's thinking and my philosophy and who I am as an educator, and still does to this day. It's about opportunity systems. Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, but I want us to be careful because a feedback that I get a lot is, oh, this is just for those special ed kids, or this is just for those struggling learners, but it's not. So let me tell you another story that I think is something that, people don't think of often. A young girl in high school who's open enrolling about an hour away to a district. She actually has engaged in AP courses her entire high school career. And as she gets to the new school and she's commuting back and forth, and she's got 2-a-day volleyball practices. So she's leaving her house at 5 o'clock in the morning and not getting home to her house till 9 o'clock in the evening. And then you have to go to bed so you can get up and your body can actually function the next day, right? Guess what happened to that student in her AP Calc class and her AP History and her AP Language Arts?
She couldn't keep up.
Couldn't keep up. So guess what happened? I had to scoot class. I had to change. It was me. I had to change courses because I just couldn't. But had I had opportunities to be able to take a picture of my book, because I couldn't read in the car because it would make me sick.
Yeah.
But if I had opportunity to look at things or get my meaning in a different way, and then be able to show what I know in different ways, things would have been much different for me, and I probably would have just been positioned differently going into college. So it's not just for, we always get that, right? It's just for those kids. No, it's not. And I think we need to have a full spectrum looking at a broader range of learner needs, not just struggling learners.
Yeah, and I didn't say my point very well, but I agree with you so heartily that I
know you do. I just wanted to clarify that for any listeners.
But my larger point was this, and what I was trying to say very clearly was, I don't care whether the kid has a disability or not when we give them that tool. And that was the point I was trying to make, was that the disability becomes irrelevant because the tool makes the disability or the inequity or whatever it is invisible. And that's really my goal for the whole thing.
But wait, Craig, it's cheating, right? I mean, really, that's another misconception we have. So what I'm trying to do is illustrate some of these misconceptions that we get over and over again from that fixed mindset that we're working, and the historical mindset that we're working from.
So I am currently in an advanced quant statistics doc class. Woo! Learning all kinds of stuff. And, I know some stats, I know a little bit, but I'm getting into a zone that's very new for me. So I'm going to put this on record. I am a fan of the Macintosh. Okay. So I like my Mac, and my new learning environment and my new work environment is not a Mac orientation environment. So I have my brand new Mac Air that I've purchased from my local store, and we live through my doc classes together. But as I'm using a new program, SPSS, you know what I'm bringing up every single time I'm doing a new learning experience? I get my QuickTime open, I do a screencast, I make sure every single click I'm recording it, because I know that I'm going to have to go back and rewatch every move in order to make sure that I'm doing the formula correctly to get the predictive analytics that I want. And I know that I need that more than the person who is next to me in this particular last weekend. And I think about that access for, our kids who are in AP Calc or whatever the case may be, who the teacher in that moment, a kid may ask a question. The teacher takes the teachable moment, teaches the whole class something new or interesting, and maybe it's on the board. But if every kid had a phone opportunity to take a picture of that app, upload it, use that whatever device they might have in order to gain access, it does become a leveling of the playing field, right? And then probably increases the collaboration too between students to really share and learn information. And it's not cheating when I'm doing my QuickTime cast. I'm telling you that right now. I'm watching that thing over and over and over again. And then this was the best moment. Somebody got sick with the flu. They couldn't be there. Guess what I was able to do for them? Send them the video of my QuickTime cast with my notes and say, hey, I hope this is helpful for you. And then their questions pushed my learning so that I could actually teach them what I learned. So, we have to think about, I think you're right, that question of cheating and academic integrity comes up. But that's a former mental model. Of a very standardized model. And when we think about it, the social construction, this is a concept too that Zamuda writes about. The social construction it's not just collaboration, it's about constructing knowledge together, but you're doing that through access.
And we talk about this, but I think the greatest thing about having every student use these tools, it's going to destigmatize. I had to think that word out through my head. It should destigmatize everything that, other kids are facing, the problems that they're facing. Especially when we think, a lot of teachers have this one mindset of a successful learner, and that is wrong. I mean, jagged profile, we'll go back to the myth of average. But yeah, I just want every student to be able to use those tools so that the one who really needs that tool to learn as well as anybody else, they don't have to stand out in that. And, one of my favorite things, I always have my list of favorite things that made me happy as a teacher, is when I used back channels, and my shyest student, who was one of my smartest, was participating because she wouldn't do it out loud, but she would do it on that back channel. Yeah. And she became even smarter because of it. And that, that's one of my happy moments I always go back to. But destigmatizing everything should be one of those very important things by getting everybody on board.
and the other thing about it is, and I think Noreen illustrated this perfectly, is that at the end of the day, what I'm most interested in is output. What can the kid produce? And as adults, it's hypocritical because we do it all the time. I mean, she just illustrated a perfect example of someone who's extremely bright, extremely high functioning, who's doing something that in some academic circles, in the K-12 environment at least, would be considered unethical. And that to me is mind-boggling, because as adults, people do play to their strengths. I mean, the people who are successful, I say this all the time, have learned how to play to their strengths. I mean, that's what you do. You find a job and you learn how to do the things you're good at.
Yeah.
And we don't penalize people for that. In fact, we go out of our way to reward them for that type of behavior. So why we don't do this in K-12 is really beyond me, in a lot of ways. Folks, we are at 50 minutes of great conversation here, and I think we could talk for another hour and a half because we've got such a great guest and such a great set of topics. But I do want to honor our listeners' times, because we could talk for much longer, but we try not to go much more than 45 minutes, and we've gone into 50 already. So I do want to kind of wrap it up. And before we do, I want to leave it open to Noreen. Is there anything else you want to say, or sort of words of wisdom, parting shot? You don't have to. You don't need to do an Andy Rooney thing with us, but if you had something you didn't say that you thought was absolutely essential, I want to give you the opportunity to do that before we wrap up.
Well, I may not be as wise as Paul Harvey or Andy Rooney, but I do believe it's every learner, all the time, all access. I mean, that's it. And we owe it to every kid to think beyond our own mental models of where we've been in the past, and really embrace where we need to go in the future. And every learner, all the time, all access. That's it.
Well, those are great words to end on. So, all right. Thanks so much, Noreen. We really loved having you here. Maybe have you back. Maybe have you back someday, because this is a great conversation.
We'll do part 2.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. Well, we're going to wrap up this show. We hope to have you listen to us again in March. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.